I've always been an avid hiker, and after a rough breakup, I decided to take a solo trip across the country to clear my head. My ex had been someone I thought I'd marry, until I discovered she'd been seeing one of my closest friends behind my back. It was a betrayal I couldn't shake, and at 31, I needed to get away. Utah was one of the places I'd looked forward to most on my journey. The vast wilderness there had always been on my hiking bucket list, especially the Wasatch National Forest. It promised solitude, which was exactly what I needed. I'm not one for crowded trails where every step echoes with chatter. I prefer the quiet isolation of lesser-known paths, so I deliberately chose an unnamed section of the forest. I drove along a narrow, winding road that cut deep into the woods until the trail became too rugged for my car. Stepping out, I took a deep breath of the crisp air, relishing the peace. No cell service. Just the way I like it. I geared up, committed my starting point to memory, and began my trek. I know, hiking alone in a place like that isn't exactly the safest idea, but I thrive on the unpredictability of it. Besides, I had downloaded a digital map in advance. Most people don't realize their phone's GPS still works without service. So no, I didn't get lost. If only that were the reason behind what happened. But what I experienced out there is something far stranger, something I still can't fully explain. My plan was simple: hike to a lookout point about 3 or 4 miles away, a secluded spot at the summit of a nearby mountain. The terrain was rough, and I wasn't making fast progress, maybe a mile and a half an hour. After about an hour, light rain began to fall, and I'm not one to continue hiking in wet conditions. Rain gets under my skin. Irritated, I decided to turn back. The sooner I got to my car, the better. When I finally spotted my vehicle in the distance, relief washed over me. But as I got closer, that relief quickly turned to dread. All 4 tires were flat, slashed. My stomach dropped. This wasn't some unlucky accident. Someone had deliberately done this. I spun around, scanning the trees, straining to hear anything over the rain. But there was only the soft patter of droplets against the leaves. No sign of anyone. With no cell service, my options were limited, and none of them were good. The nearest spot I remembered having signal was about 20 miles down that desolate road. The idea of walking out in the open, vulnerable, made my skin crawl. Instead, I decided to head back into the forest and make for the summit. It was risky, but I figured high ground would be my best chance to get a signal and call for help. As I retraced my steps into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. Sure enough, about halfway to the summit, I heard a faint rustling behind me. Every time I moved, the sound followed. I forced myself not to turn around. My pace quickened. Whoever was out there, I was determined to outrun them. The forest was growing darker as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the rain wasn't letting up. My nerves were on edge, but I pressed on. When I finally reached the summit, a small miracle occurred. There was cell service. I didn't waste a second. I called the police, explaining my situation and my suspicion that someone was stalking me. I also contacted AAA. With help on the way, I felt a flicker of relief. But there was still a long way back through the forest, and whoever had been following me was likely still out there. I knew I couldn't return the same way I came. I decided to loop around, keeping parallel to the cliff edge before cutting back into the woods. The plan was simple enough: avoid whatever trap might be waiting for me. I kept checking the map on my phone, making sure I stayed on course. For a while, it seemed to be working. I didn't hear any unusual sounds, no movement behind me. But then, out of nowhere, I heard a twig snap to my left. I stopped and looked, but saw nothing. A few minutes later, a noise came from behind me, closer this time. It was then I realized there wasn't just one person out there. There were several. My heart pounded as I picked up the pace, breaking into a light jog. That's when I stumbled upon something chilling. Hidden away in a small clearing was a makeshift camp. A ring of logs circled a dead campfire, and it was clear someone had been there recently. Without stopping, I skirted around it and pressed on, my eyes darting through the trees. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement, a flash of a foot disappearing behind a tree. That was it. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a full sprint. The sounds of pursuit grew louder behind me, no longer hidden. I didn't dare look back, but eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw them, at least 6 figures, all dressed in white, closing in on me. My legs burned, and my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I ran as fast as I could, the thought of what would happen if they caught me pushing me forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I spotted my car, and just behind it was a police cruiser. I collapsed near the officer, gasping for breath. When I turned to look back, the people who had been chasing me had vanished. The cop told me he had already called AAA, and I gave him a full report of what had happened. What he told me next still haunts me. Apparently, that part of Utah is home to a number of isolated, religious groups, and it wasn't unheard of for hikers to stumble upon them in the woods. The forest I had been exploring had a history of cult activity, and the officer believed I had likely crossed paths with one such group. Even now, I can't fully grasp what happened out there. Why didn't they just confront me if I was trespassing? What was the point of stalking and chasing me like that? I still don't have answers, but the memory of that day sticks with me, a mystery I may never solve. I wouldn't call myself a seasoned hiker, but trekking through rugged trails has been a passion of mine for many years. I've ventured along countless major paths across the U.S. and have explored over 3/4 of this country's national parks. As a result, I've had to come up with new ways to keep the thrill alive. My latest interest? Scanning Google Maps for vast, unnamed stretches of wilderness and simply wandering into them. It's not the most conventional approach, but the thrill of the unknown outweighs the risk of losing my way. At least, that's what I thought. I've developed a technique to keep track of my route, carrying a set of homemade stickers that I attach to trees as I go, ensuring I don't lose track of the path. When I retrace my steps, I peel them off, leaving no trace behind. It's a trick that's helped me navigate some tricky terrain, and I'm surprised more people don't do the same. It virtually eliminates the chance of getting lost. This time, however, I had a particularly challenging goal in mind, exploring the Dudleytown Forest in Connecticut. Now, most people would hesitate just hearing the name. The entire town was deserted back in the 1800s, and there's no shortage of eerie stories about the place. You could dive into some research if you're into that sort of thing. Personally, I'm not. Ghost stories and superstition don't faze me. The forest itself is technically off limits to the public, but rules like that haven't stopped me before. From my perspective, it meant I wouldn't have to worry about running into anyone else, a perfect scenario for me. The forecast warned of blistering heat, so I made sure to pack plenty of water and set out on foot after parking nearby. The initial stretch was easy, despite the rugged landscape. There was an odd beauty to the place, even under the relentless summer sun. After an hour or so, I decided to push beyond the town's boundaries and venture deeper into the untouched forest. I'm no believer in the paranormal, but I do believe in pacing myself, so I figured it was time for a break and started scouting for a shady spot to rest and eat. That's when something strange caught my attention. A child. A boy, sitting alone on a tree stump. He couldn't have been more than 12, and seeing him so deep in the forest was jarring. He wore a baggy t-shirt and long basketball shorts, his clothes streaked with dirt. He clutched something in his hands, though from where I stood, I couldn't tell what it was. I quickly scanned the area, expecting to see an adult, a parent, anyone, but it was just me, the boy, in the dense forest. I approached him cautiously, trying to make sense of the situation. "Hey there, are you all right?" I called out. Silence. Where are your parents? I asked, a bit louder this time. Still nothing. The way he looked at me was unsettling, not frightened, not lost, just vacant. His expression was as hollow as the silence around us. Unease began creeping in. I moved closer, trying to keep my voice calm. But before I could get too close, he sprang to his feet and bolted into the woods. Wait! Stop! Are you okay? I shouted, instinctively running after him. He moved far quicker than I would have thought possible for a kid his size. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't catch up. In a matter of moments, he vanished into the thick forest, as if he'd never been there at all. I spent the next few hours combing the woods, shouting his name even though I didn't know it. But it was pointless. There was no trace of him, no sound, no sign. It was as though the forest had swallowed him whole. That encounter left a knot in my stomach. I cut my hike short that day, a lingering sense of dread hanging over me. I haven't returned to Dudleytown since. It was during one of my usual hikes in Northern California, on a familiar trail I had traversed a few times before. I wasn't concerned about getting lost, as I knew the path well, and my phone's GPS served as a backup. I started my trek early, hoping to avoid the oppressive heat that usually strikes by midday. A few hours into my hike, I stumbled upon a clearing I hadn't noticed on any of my previous trips. There were no signs or markers indicating its existence, and it didn't appear on any maps I had checked. My curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to explore. Something felt off about the place. The trees encircling the area were noticeably older, their twisted branches casting deep shadows across the ground. In the center of the clearing lay a large, flat stone, and the air around me had an unusual chill, far cooler than the surrounding trail. Despite the growing sense of unease, I pressed forward, drawn to the strange rock. When I reached the stone, I realized it wasn't just any rock. There was something etched into its surface, an unfamiliar symbol or pattern. It looked deliberate, not something shaped by natural forces. I knelt down to study it more closely, but I couldn't decipher its meaning. As I was lost in thought, a faint sound broke the silence. A rustling in the underbrush behind me. I whipped around, but saw nothing. The forest remained still. I called out, half expecting to hear a reply, but there was only silence. Telling myself it must have been a small animal, I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling and return my focus to the stone. But the noise came again. Louder this time. Closer. I turned once more, scanning the edge of the clearing, but once again, there was no one there. A creeping sense of dread began to take hold of me. Something wasn't right. Instinct told me to leave, and as I took a step back toward the trail, something caught my eye, a figure, standing at the tree line, barely visible. Watching. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was too distant to make out any details, but I knew, without a doubt, it was a person. They stood completely still, their gaze fixed on me, unblinking. A shiver ran down my spine as I debated my next move. Confronting them seemed unwise, but running might provoke something worse. So I stood frozen, locked in a silent stare with the figure, time seeming to stretch endlessly. Eventually, my sense of self-preservation kicked in. I turned, walking quickly, almost running, back toward the trail, refusing to look away from the figure. It didn't move, just kept watching, motionless, until I finally reached the safety of the familiar path. When I glanced back one last time, the figure had vanished. I've returned to that trail several times since, but I've never ventured back to that strange clearing. Whatever I encountered that day still lingers in my mind, an eerie question that I'm not sure I ever want answered.